Good afternoon. I come at this from a somewhat different angle from within one sector, admittedly an important sector of the economy. I have been involved with the automotive industry for the last 40 years almost. I'm not actually a manufacturing expert. I've been more interested in it as an economic, social, technical, and everything phenomenon. I'm not here to plead for it or represent it. Indeed, I've often been quite critical of it. But I do want to explore some of the implications of the options that we may want to exercise with respect to the European Union. And I'm going to address three topics this afternoon. One, how does this industry work? Because it is a rather peculiar industry. Two, what is the UK's role in it? What's been achieved? And three, what lessons we might draw from this. So first, how does it work? Well, over the last 100 years, it's undergone huge structural shifts, certainly the volume car industry, all driven by the search for maximum scale and minimum cost. This first emerged in the US when Henry Ford started with mass production, the assembly line and the use of interchangeable parts. There was a similar shakeout within the individual European countries, including the UK itself. Within Europe, national vehicle manufacturers then began to interpenetrate each other's markets, home markets in the 1960s. There was almost an anticipation of the single market by the vehicle industry. Next, manufacturers moved from a continental to a global scale with a further reduction in their numbers. And today, we have three planetary supergiants vying for the first spot: Toyota, VW, and General Motors. Each of them building over 10 million vehicles a year, which, you know, if you value a vehicle at £10,000, that is an enormous amount of turnover, out of a world total of 80 million. So the volume car industry is in fact already a near oligopoly with some very big players in it. There have been new entrants in volume cars, notably the Japanese, who made radical innovations in productivity and quality. They were handed the American market on a plate in the 1980s, when the US government forced Detroit to downsize its gas guzzlers. They followed up in Europe, offering cars and light commercials that may not have been very sexy, but which were reliable and were nicely priced. Political pressures, both in the US and Europe, led to voluntary restraint agreements on their imports, and therefore the onshoring, the creation of the so-called transplant assembly plants, Japanese assembly plants first in the US and then in Europe. South Korea followed a blatantly government-supported massive export drive, with imports ruthlessly shut out of Korea. But in the end, only Hyundai of the four Koreans survived as an independent group, very successfully too. I once expected the Chinese manufacturers or Chinese manufacturers to emerge and do the same thing. In fact, they have not, and the majority of Chinese production is controlled by the joint ventures with the foreign manufacturers. India's automotive industry is increasingly coming under foreign control. Russia's industry is now almost wholly foreign controlled. Brazil is a European automotive colony. In short, the oligopoly of established players, American, European, and Japanese, has pretty much kept its grip. Competition in volume cars is generally ferocious. Brands are difficult to distinguish objectively. Look at the TV commercials, they talk about everything except the product. There's an excess of producers, of products, of production, particularly in Europe. Profitability is weak in the volume sector and is made up by overcharging for service and parts under the cover of the industry's unique, and I would say abnormal, franchise dealer distribution system. Where the local market justifies it, which normally means a major regional market such as North America or Europe, or host governments impose it, volume car manufacturers will set up local assembly operations. The BRIC, the emerging country car markets, are strongly protected against imports because they protect their emerging industries as far as they can. And actually, there's rather little interregional trade in volume cars because they tend to be produced locally. There is a second industry within the industry, the global oligopoly in premium cars, dominated by the Germans, BMW, Mercedes and Audi, and only partly challenged by Lexus, Jaguar Land Rover and Alfa Romeo. In this sector, brands are distinguishable because they're based on real differences between the products. Pricing is much more orderly and profitability much better, Because of the lower volumes, there's much less of a tendency to build locally and much more exporting worldwide from the home base. And beyond that, then we have a number of specialists and niche producers. The third major long-term trend has been the steadily increased delegation of responsibility for major subsystems and specific components to the supplier industry. The pioneer manufacturers had to make everything themselves, but as the industry grew prodigiously and as vehicles became ever more sophisticated and complex, the vehicle manufacturers could no longer develop all the technologies or make all the necessary investments themselves. And today, and this is often unrealized, unknown, suppliers engineer and make 80% of the car. As vehicle manufacturers set up their assembly operations in foreign markets, they require their suppliers to follow them, often reinforced by host governments imposing local content requirements. Most sourcing is from the region of vehicle assembly, and there's an obvious tendency within that to seek out lower countries within the region, such as Romania within Europe. The ownership of the supplier industries has also interpenetrated. Turning over 2 pages. Has interpenetrated geographically, become globalized and oligopolistic by area of technical competence. Cars are complex assembled goods, becoming ever more so, although gradually and prudently. The product development and production chains are long and involve a multiplicity of actors, all contributing to the final product. No part or subsystem has any independent market value outside the vehicle for which it is destined. What would you do with a brake pad except as a rather ugly paperweight? So there are no true market interfaces between the layers or tiers of the industry. Neither this nor the natural oligopolies fit very well with the prescriptions of classical economics. And the industry is in fact not terribly well regarded by the capital markets, and reciprocally it is not much like financial investors. The creation and running of this huge global system represents perhaps the greatest triumph of 20th century industrial organization. It mass produces increasingly sophisticated and complex products to very high levels of reliability and safety at astonishingly low and decreasing real unit costs at constant content. The whole automotive system is run by the vehicle manufacturers with a rod of iron to the steady beat of the product renewal cycle, with great pricing pressure exerted on the suppliers. Finally, the industry in fact has a love-hate relationship with government. It's heavily regulated for imperative reasons of safety and environmental protection. But the outcome has in fact, despite the industry's reluctance, been remarkable progress in both respects. This does add a lot of content and cost, which is why the industry legitimately seeks consistency and stability in regulation. Of course, achieving the right balance is a constant source of discussion and conflict. Because of inadequate profitability, the volume sector has developed a regrettable tendency to demand support for investing in a country and to threaten to withdraw from it if more support is not forthcoming. The industry has been second only to the banks in using the too big to fail argument. It's received a great deal of support, too much of it protectionist, and this has too often inhibited rather than encouraged overdue shakeouts. Second topic, after all that, where does Britain fit in? Post-war British cars were too often unattractively designed and of poor quality. Productivity and industrial relations in the British car industry were notoriously bad. Government policy towards the industry was for long notably feeble and often contradictory, in great contrast, for example, to the systematic support of VW by both the Reich government and the government of the Federal Republic. Other than Ford, the British volume manufacturers were doomed once interpenetration between European countries started. Not having much more to lose, the UK government played the transplant card brilliantly, showed a great independence, landing first Nissan and then both Honda and Toyota. It had to fight against the vehement opposition coming from the European industry, of course. But not only did we get those new assembly plants and secure open access to European markets for their output, we also acquired a precious body of skills in the Japanese techniques of industrial organization and management. Ford acquired Jaguar and later Land Rover and made a huge contribution to improving their fairly lamentable quality and productivity. It later sold them to Tata and also Volvo to Geely of China when it had to put its US house in order without the help of Uncle Sam, unlike GM and Chrysler. BMW tried with Rover, but is now left with only Mini and the Cowley assembly plant. Where are we now? It's a success, relatively. 1.6 million vehicles were built here in 2014, of which 1.5 million cars, not far from the historic peak, and 2.5 million engines, which is a lot. In contrast, French national production, is down to 1.9 million from a peak of over 3 million, and they look at us with amazement. But they have kept control of two large global car groups in the form of Renault, Nissan and PSA. Italian production has halved. Germany is still going full bore at 5.5 million cars a year, dominating Europe both in vehicle building and components production. It's kept the high-value stuff at home while spreading lower-value production into Eastern Europe, China partly, and Brazil. And this is true of both vehicle manufacturers and component suppliers. The UK's external trade in passenger cars was almost balanced in 2014. £25.7 billion in exports, 28.1 million in imports, which is pretty good going, seeing where we came from. But, as already been said, there was a 15.7 billion deficit with the EU, of which 12.5 from Germany alone. 2/3 of the exports of the Japanese transplant factories here go to the EU. That's what they were set up to supply. But that's not enough to compensate for all those EU imports, which have a higher average value, all those Mercedes and BMWs and whatnots coming in. Conversely, we had a £13.3 billion surplus with the rest of the world, 3.7 billion with North America, a notable 5.4 billion with China, 1.4 billion with Russia, another 1.4 billion with the Middle East and North Africa. But very little into Brazil because it's totally closed. Jaguar Land Rover exports are much lower in volume than those of those Japanese transplants, but higher in unit value. They make much better, bigger cars. 60% of them go outside the EU, which is interesting, it's reversed. But premium brands generally do export more outside their home region of origin than do volume brands, as I mentioned earlier. However, we're not home yet. The UK's overall automotive trade balance in aggregate remains 13.5 billion in the whole. And it's partly because of commercial vehicles, but above all, it's because of the component sector. The UK-controlled component sector was devastated by the failure of the original car industry. UK vehicle assemblers extensively resourced from the rest of Europe. Interestingly, at the time, if I go back 12 years or so, the industry leant towards Euro membership as it doesn't like unstable exchange rates. It loves certainty when it can get it. The Automotive Council is working hard to bring component supply back on shore. It aims to replace imports, but there are some limits to that. Whether it will generate significant exports other than the re-export of components within UK-built vehicles remains to be seen. Yep, attracting the Japanese. Well, I'll cut short on the rest on the automotive industry, and go and skip essentially to the lessons. The first one, given the characteristics of this industry, is about stability and reassurance. The chairman of Toyota and Renault Nissan have made threatening noises about what will happen if we leave the European Union. I think they need reassurance. I think it's a very great progress that there is actually some concrete proposals for what an alternative to EU membership might be. And I think that will need to be explained to this industry, because otherwise they might panic. The second, frankly, is to avoid exaggeration. I mean, it's been said that European Union state aid rules inhibited the saving of Rover. Well, Rover was beyond saving, and I would argue that they actually prevented the British government throwing more money down that rat hole. And I think you can make similar arguments like that. Euro 5 and Euro 6 regulations on depollution of vehicles were not some kind of alien, one-sided imposition on the British car industry. They were something that was necessary and was agreed at the European level. Technical standards have to be fixed at a high level, and the industry actually wants this. It does not want regional particularities. And the third is to be realistic. The UK automotive industry continues to do its bit in a very difficult industry, but the UK has a much bigger job to do rebalancing its economy, creating more competitive exporting businesses, particularly in high-tech manufacturing. We have a huge hole in our balance of payments. We have created a lot of jobs, but we need to create a lot more higher value jobs, and we need those businesses and those jobs in order to have the tax revenues to plug the government deficit. I think we just need to be careful not to think that simply leaving the EU under however satisfactory a formula is going to solve all those problems. We have a very big job to do, and it's going to take some time. Thank you very much.